There is an image of the Vikings that has haunted the imagination of the world for centuries. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed warriors from the frozen north, untouched by the outside world, sailing their longships out of a homeland called Scandinavia. A race apart, a distinct Nordic people whose blood remained pure from the Bronze Age to the modern era. This image has been carved into cultural memory by 19th century romantic paintings and modern television sagas. The Vikings were the original Scandinavians, and the Scandinavians are the original Vikings, a straight line of genetic and cultural continuity stretching back into the mists of time. The story was simple, clean, powerful. It gave Northern Europe its own origin myth, a people shaped solely by their own fjords and forests, untouched by the great migrations that churned the rest of the continent. In 2020, a team of scientists published a study that detonated that image. They had sequenced the DNA of over 400 ancient humans from across the Viking world. What they found in the bones of the dead should not exist. Not according to everything we thought we knew. The people we call Vikings were not a pure Nordic race. They were a mixed civilization, a crossroads of three continents. Their genes tell a story of movement, meeting, and mixing that the sagas never recorded. The truth of their origin was written not in the runestones, but in their bones. The traditional story of the Vikings is one we all know. From the late 8th to the mid-11th century, the seafaring Norsemen burst onto the European stage. They came from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, three kingdoms with distinct identities but all sharing a common Nordic heritage. Historians describe them as descendants of the original Germanic tribes, who had lived in Scandinavia for thousands of years, isolated by geography and climate, preserving a northern European bloodline. When they raided and traded across the continent, they remained distinct, a northern force that left its genetic mark on others but remained unchanged themselves. The sagas reinforce this image, telling tales of heroic Norwegian settlers, Danish conquerors, and Swedish traders, each group pure in its own way. For centuries, this explanation made perfect sense. Beneath the surface of this tidy story, buried in the graves of Viking warriors and farmers alike, the earth held secrets that would rewrite everything. To understand the Vikings, we have to understand the world that produced them. Scandinavia has been inhabited since the end of the last ice age, but it was never a sealed container. The first significant population layer came with the arrival of farming peoples, who brought a genetic signature rooted in the early farmers of Anatolia. These were not the Vikings. They were a different people with a different way of life. Then came the warriors of the Bronze Age, carrying new technologies and new ancestry from the vast Eurasian steppe, layer upon layer built up over millennia. By the time we reached the Roman Iron Age, Scandinavia was already a complex genetic mosaic. The canvas was prepared. The painting had not yet begun. That painting would prove to be far more violent, far more colorful, and far more unexpected than anyone ever imagined. The transformation into the Viking Age was not a sudden eruption of a pure people. It was a period of intense genetic upheaval. In 2020, a landmark study published in the journal Nature dropped like a thunderclap. An international team led by Eske Willerslev at the University of Copenhagen sequenced the genomes of over 400 ancient humans from across Europe and Greenland, spanning the Bronze Age to the early modern period. The results were devastating to the old narrative. During the centuries leading up to the Viking Age and throughout the Viking Age itself, a massive influx of foreign gene flow entered Scandinavia. People from the south and the east were arriving, mixing, and becoming part of the population. This was not a one-way street of Vikings going out. It was a constant two-way flow of people coming in. The idea of a pure Nordic homeland collapsed in the face of the data. Scandinavia was not a source, it was a destination. It was a magnet. The sagas tell stories of specific Viking settlers, men like Grimus Kamban, who legend says settled the Faroe Islands 1,200 years ago. For generations, historians assumed that the settlements of the North Atlantic followed a simple pattern. Norwegians sailed west, populating the islands with a relatively homogeneous Norse population. The archaeology always whispered of something more complex. Were the Faroese and Icelanders truly the same people? Was there a hidden diversity in the Viking expansion? For decades, the bones kept their silence. In 2024, the silence shattered. A study published in Frontiers in Genetics, led by Christopher Tilquist at the University of Louisville, examined the Y chromosome DNA of men from the Faroe Islands and compared them to populations across Scandinavia and Ireland. The results sent shockwaves through the academic world. Icelanders showed a relatively similar gene pool. The Faroese were fundamentally different. They carried a broad range of genetic markers from throughout Scandinavia. Their founding population was not a single Nordic tribe. They were a mixed group drawn from across the Nordic world. The saga of Grimus Kamban hid a more complex truth. His followers came from all over Scandinavia, not just one region. The genetic signatures of these two island populations remain distinct to this day. The Viking expansion into the North Atlantic was not a single event. It was a series of genetically distinct movements, with each of its own story. In January 2023, a study in the journal Cell pushed the investigation even deeper. The ground shifted beneath our feet. Researchers led by Ricardo Rodriguez Varela reconstructed a 2,000-year genetic transect through Scandinavia, from the Iron Age to the present day. They found clear evidence of gene flow from three distinct external sources during the Viking period and beyond: the Eastern Baltic, the British-Irish Isles, and Southern Europe. British-Irish ancestry became widespread throughout Scandinavia starting in the Viking Age. People from the British Isles were not just being raided, they were moving to Scandinavia, settling down, farming the land, and having families. Their genes entered the Nordic pool and spread generation after generation. Eastern Baltic ancestry was more localized, concentrated in Gotland and central Sweden. The map of Viking genetics was not a solid color. It was a complex patchwork stitched together from threads across the continent. The DNA tells us that this genetic mixing was not uniform across all levels of society. In the great ship burials of the Viking elite, where chieftains and kings were laid to rest with their weapons and their wealth, the genetic signatures often tell a strikingly different story from the common graves. At Birka in Sweden, a high-status warrior was interred with swords, axes, and 2 horses. For decades, archaeologists assumed this was a great chieftain. DNA testing revealed the warrior was female. A woman buried as a high-ranking warrior, her genetic signature showing connections far beyond Scandinavia. At the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, one of the most spectacular Viking graves ever found, 2 women were buried surrounded by unimaginable wealth. DNA analysis showed that the younger woman had origins in the Black Sea region. She was not Norse. She came from the edge of the steppe, yet she was buried as Viking royalty. The ruling class sometimes preserved distinct paternal lineages with remarkable fidelity. They married strategically, forming alliances that maintained power while carefully protecting their patrilineal inheritance. In some regions, elite families show far less admixture than the general population. Noble status was tied to perceived purity of lineage. Yet even here, the pattern defies simplicity. In other elite burials, particularly those connected to trade routes and diplomatic marriages, foreign women of high status were incorporated. Their genes entered the noble lines and spread through the upper echelons of society. The elite were not immune to mixing. They just mixed on their own terms. This is the genetic signature of a stratified society. Identity and genetics interacted differently at the top than they did at the bottom. The chieftain's daughter who married a foreign king, the Norse noble who took a British wife, the Swedish trader who settled in the Baltic. Each of these elite decisions left its mark in the DNA of the generations to follow. Another revelation is buried in this data. The 2020 Nature study found that the Vikings who traveled east were genetically different from the ones who traveled west. Danish Vikings moved toward England. Swedish Vikings headed east into the Baltic and what is now Russia. Norwegian Vikings sailed west to Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. Different populations with distinct genetic makeups pursued different paths. The Vikings who raided Lindisfarne were not the same people, genetically speaking, as those who traded in Kiev. The warrior who burned the monastery in England shared ancestors with his victim in ways neither could have imagined. The trader who sailed down the Volga carried genes that would end up in the blood of Russian princes.
The Viking world was not a monolith. It was a network of related but distinct communities with each of its own genetic history. The idea of a single Viking people dissolves when you look at the DNA. Perhaps the most striking finding from the 2020 cell study overturns everything we thought we knew about purity and change. Modern Scandinavians have less non-local ancestry than their Viking Age ancestors did. In some regions, the level of external ancestry has dropped over time. The immigrants who arrived during the Viking Age did not always contribute proportionally to the modern gene pool. Their descendants, in some cases, did not have as many children, or were absorbed in ways that diluted their genetic signature over the centuries. The Vikings themselves were more diverse than the people living in those same lands today.
In some regions, modern populations are genetically more uniform than their Viking ancestors were. The past was more mixed than the present. The largest misconception of all is the idea that there ever was a pure Nordic race. The DNA evidence dismantles this with cold, clinical precision. The 2023 study also showed that the north-south genetic cline that characterizes modern Scandinavians is largely due to differential levels of Uralic ancestry. This is ancestry connected to the Sami and other Finno-Ugric-speaking peoples. It has been present in Scandinavia for a very long time, contributing to the genetic diversity of the region since before the Viking Age even began. There is no single Nordic genome. There never was. There is only a mosaic, built from the contributions of farmers, warriors, traders, and migrants from across 3 continents. The Vikings were not a race. They were an activity, an identity, a period, a way of life. The people who went Viking came from a world that was already mixed. They carried within them the genes of Southern Europeans, British Islanders, Eastern Balts, and Uralic peoples. As they traveled, they mixed further, leaving their DNA in the places they touched and bringing new DNA home with them. The woman from the Black Sea buried as a queen in Norway, the warrior woman of Birka, the Faroe settlers drawn from across Scandinavia, the British mothers whose genes spread through the Nordic world. These are not exceptions, they are the rule. The elite among them navigated this mixing strategically, preserving power while absorbing what served them. The common people lived with the consequences generation after generation, their bones holding the evidence. The story of the Vikings does not become smaller with this knowledge. It becomes larger. It expands to include not only the warriors of the fjords, but also the women from the British Isles who became mothers in Scandinavia. Not only the traders from Sweden who sailed east, but also the Baltic peoples who joined them. Not only the chieftains in their ship burials, but also the foreign brides who rest beside them. The secret hidden in the Viking graves for over 1,000 years is finally out. The DNA does not erase the identity of the Nordic peoples, it deepens it. The story of a people is not written in a single line of descent. It is written in the movements, the meetings, the resistance, and the resilience that leave their trace forever in our genes. In the soil of Scandinavia, beneath the runestones and the long ship burials, the past is not a memory. It is a living presence. The woman from the Black Sea still rests in her ship. The warrior of Birka still holds her weapons. The Faroe settlers still carry the markers of their diverse origins. The British mothers, the Baltic traders, the steppe warriors, they all live on in the blood of millions who still walk those northern lands today. What is true for the Scandinavians is true for all of us. We are not the descendants of a single distant past. We are all, in our own way, the living memory of 1,000 hidden histories, written in a code we are only now learning to read. The code was always there, silent in our bones. If the Viking myth was wrong, how many other origin myths are waiting in the ground? If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe and join us for the next deep dive.